Welcome to the ARCO Forum at the Kennedy School of Government for a discussion about one of the most important topics America can take on. Can we bridge the racial divide? The racial history of the United States is the history of the United States is in large part a story of race. One needs only think about urban history and ask the question, why is it that people live where they live? To have race be part of the answer. Labor history, who got which jobs when and why? To have race be part of the answer. Political history, who got to vote when? And race will be part of the answer. Some of this history, much of this history, is very sad, much of it is tragic, but much of it is also hopeful. And tonight we want to talk about the hopeful part. We have two outstanding people to talk about this. First, William Julius Wilson. And this forum is in fact in honor of Bill's new book, Bridging the Racial Divide. Bill is the Lewis P. and Linda L. Geiser University professor at Harvard. He's one of our nation's premier sociologists and a leading authority on urban poverty and race. Bill's work has been influential in stimulating the thinking of a generation of scholars and activists, and it certainly has been influential in stimulating the thinking of Kennedy School faculty. Bill has written an enormous number of articles, but perhaps is best known for his books. I don't have time to list all of his books or all of Theta's books, but I'll list a few of them. The Declining Significance of Race, When Work Disappears, The Truly Disadvantaged, and most recently, Bridging the Racial Divide. This latest book is built on a lifetime of scholarship and thought as well as personal experience, and is an important book for all of us to read and think about. Bill has also won numerous awards, including a MacArthur Prize Fellowship and the National Science Medal, America's equivalent of the Nobel. And lest you think Bill is all scholar and author, he also won a Dinner on the Dean, which probably many of you don't know about, but that's our Dean's Reward for faculty members who are outstanding as teachers as judged by the students. And Bill is a winner. Theda Skocpol, also a sociologist, is the Victor F. Thomas Professor of Government and of Sociology at Harvard University. She is the author of numerous books, States and Social Revolutions, one that I know almost all of my students have read, Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, The Political Origins of Social Policy in the United States. Most recently, Civic Engagement and American Democracy, and forthcoming, The Missing Middle, Working Families and the Future of American Social Policy. So, Bill, your vision.
Thank you very much, Julie. I hate to correct one point from that great introduction. The title of the book is The Bridge Over the Racial Divide.
Right in front of me.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Let me just take about 20 minutes. Actually be less than that, more like 17 minutes, to summarize the main points of my new book, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, to set up Theda's critique, which I'm looking forward to. The main theme of the book is that economic inequality is rising in America, as reflected in the growing wage and income disparities, and that we need a progressive, multiracial coalition to combat it. I argue that a large, strong, and organized political constituency is essential for the development and implementation of policies that will blunt the impact of the rising inequality and ease the burden of ordinary families. But as long as middle and lower class groups are fragmented along racial lines, they will fail to see how their combined efforts could change the political imbalance and thus promote policies that reflect their interests. Put another way, a vision of American society that highlights racial differences rather than commonalities makes it difficult for us to see the need or appreciate the potential for mutual political support across racial lines. Sadly, in the absence of such a broad-based coalition, America could develop what the Harvard economist Richard B. Freeman calls a two-tiered society. He argues that American ideals of political classlessness, quote unquote, and shared citizenship are threatened by falling or stagnating incomes and rising inequality. And this could eventually create a society in which, he argues, the successful upper and upper middle classes live lives fundamentally different from the working classes and the poor. Now, the trends of the rising inequality are associated with the rate of productivity growth and the level of skill bias in the economy, but they can also be related to the strength of what the MIT economist Frank Levy calls the nation's equalizing institutions. By equalizing institutions, he's referring to the quality of education, the welfare state, unions, international trade regulations, and the other political structures that blunt the most extreme market outcomes and try to ensure that most people will benefit from economic growth. As he points out, we cannot legislate the rate of productivity growth, and we cannot legislate the level of skill bias in the economy. That is why equalizing institutions are important. There are now signs that this rising inequality has slowed in the last 2 years and may enter a period of remission as long as the economy remains strong. However, except for a recent increase in productivity growth, there is little evidence to suggest that the basic shifts in the economy that have been associated with the rise in inequality are changing. I therefore see the need for a national multiracial political coalition with a broad-based agenda to strengthen our nation's equalizing institutions. Now, when I speak of a multiracial coalition, I'm not calling for the formation of a third political party, nor am I referring to a coalition that would be officially aligned with either of the major political parties. Indeed, my idea is that the coalition would be officially bipartisan or nonpartisan. Its purpose would be to put pressure, including voting pressure, on both Democratic and Republican leaders to embrace policies that reflect the interests of ordinary people. Now, it's true that Republicans are virtually united against many policies that would help working people, and measures to fight inequality would likely, and that's putting it conservatively, would likely draw more support from Democrats than from Republicans. But if the coalition is perceived to be in a position both to reward and to punish political leaders, members of both parties are likely to take special notice of its activities. The foundation of the coalition would be organizations committed to fighting social inequality, including grassroots community organizations, civil rights groups, women's rights groups, labor unions, religious organizations, broadly representative of the various racial and ethnic groups, and all organized in interconnected local, regional, and national networks. Now, the leaders of each of the national networks would constitute a coordinating or executive group empowered to represent the interests of the coalition and act on its behalf. And given the potential number and type of groups involved, this coalition could represent a very large constituency. But whatever the main features of the coalition, a case has to be made for why the idea of a national multiracial coalition should be seriously considered. And that's the real purpose of my book, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide. Look, I'm not naive. I am fully aware that in light of the racial friction that has marred intergroup interaction in urban America, the formation of a multiracial reform coalition presents a challenge. Beginning with the riots in Los Angeles in 1992 and culminating in the 1995 O.J. Simpson murder trial, media attention to racial matters has highlighted those factors that divide us. And although it's certainly important to acknowledge the racial divisions in America so that they can be meaningfully addressed, the incessant attention given to these gaps has obscured the fact that Black, white, Latino, Asian, and Native Americans share many concerns and have important norms, values, and aspirations in common. We tend to view these groups as alien, and we lose sight of the commonalities. Take the issue of values. An analysis of the responses to questions that were variously asked in the national surveys reveals only marginal racial differences in core values pertaining to work, education, the family, religion, law enforcement, and civic duty. Also, consider the perception of problems. Questions about whether problems pertaining to public schools, jobs, affordable housing, families, and health care were getting worse or harder for people with whom the respondents identify elicited considerable agreement across racial and ethnic groups. Furthermore, consider views on major policy issues. Except for affirmative action and abortion, there are no notable differences across racial and ethnic groups on reported strong preferences for congressional action, with overwhelming support for things like balancing the budget and changing the welfare system, less enthusiasm for things like cutting personal income taxes and reforming Medicare, and even less for things like business tax breaks. Finally, there is considerable convergence in views across racial and ethnic groups with regard to policy preferences for solving particular problems, including problems pertaining to education, crime, gang violence, and drugs. Now, of course, this consensus does not always reflect progressive values and goals, especially when economic anxiety makes people more receptive to simplistic messages that deflect attention away from the real and complex sources of our problems. In the first half of the 1990s, for example, as the country was staggering from the effects of the 1990-92 recession, the poisonous rhetoric of highly visible spokespersons, it was open season on minorities and the poor. I mean, people were openly demonizing some of the most vulnerable groups, and there were these divisive messages out there that channeled frustrations in ways that divided groups in America. If you were paying attention to these messages, you recognize some of the messengers: Pat Buchanan, Louis Farrakhan, Al Sharpton, David Duke, Rush Limbaugh, Governor Pete Wilson, California Governor Pete Wilson, as well as Newt Gingrich and several other House members who framed the so-called 1994 Personal Responsibility Act, with their messages channeling frustrations in ways that divided groups in America. Instead of associating citizens' problems with economic and political changes, these divisive messages pitted race against race, citizens against immigrants. A multiracial coalition, by contrast, would craft political messages that resonate with broad segments of the public. And such a coalition ought to emphasize the benefits it would bring to all groups who are struggling economically in America, not just poor minorities. It should convey the idea that changes in the economy, changes in the global economy have enhanced economic inequality and, as seen during the first half of the 1990s, heightened antagonisms between different racial and ethnic groups, and that although these groups are seen as social adversaries, they are potential allies in a reform coalition. Now, social psychological research on interdependence reveals that when people believe that they need each other, they tend to relinquish their initial prejudices and stereotypes and join programs that foster mutual interaction and cooperation. Moreover, the research reveals that when people from different racial and ethnic groups do get along, their perceptions about and behavior toward each other undergo change. And under such circumstances, not only are efforts made by the participants in the research experiment to behave in ways that do not disrupt the interaction, but they also make an effort to express consistent and similar attitudes and opinions about issues that confront and concern them. These conclusions are based on a report written by the social psychologists David Johnson, Roger Johnson, and Jeffrey Maruyama, which revealed and analyzed 98 experimental studies of gold interdependence and interpersonal attraction. The report revealed that the research literature supports the idea that interpersonal attraction among different racial and ethnic groups is enhanced by cooperative experiences. The authors emphasize that one reason for enhanced cooperation is that within cooperative situations, participants benefit from encouraging others to achieve, whereas in competitive situations, participants benefit from obstructing others' efforts to achieve. Now you see where I'm going to when I'm talking about multiracial coalitions, or you're talking about cooperative situations. Accordingly, these authors argue that promotive interaction is greater within situations that are cooperative than in those that are competitive. The research reported considerably more interaction across ethnic lines in cooperative situations and more cross-ethnic helping in such situations as well. In addition, the research indicated that cooperative situations enhance social perspective taking That is, as the authors put it, the ability to understand how a situation appears to another person and how that person is reacting cognitively and emotionally to it. Finally, the research revealed that within cooperative situations, participants seem to have a differentiated view of collaborators and tended to minimize perceived differences in ability and to view all collaborators as being equally worthwhile regardless of their performance level or ability, unquote. Now, this research suggests the need for effective leadership to develop and articulate an ideological vision that not only highlights common interests, norms, values, aspirations, and goals, but also helps individuals and groups appreciate the importance of interracial cooperation to achieve and sustain them. Visionary group leaders, especially those who head strong community organizations, are essential for developing and communicating such an inclusive vision, as well as for developing and sustaining the coalition. Now, people often assume that America's history of racial divisions makes it unlikely that conditions of perceived interdependence, remember that term, perceived interdependence, a feeling that you can't achieve your goals without the help of other groups. If you cannot develop that sense of interdependence, perceived interdependence, you cannot develop or sustain your coalition. Coalitions survive as long as people believe they can't achieve their goals without the help of others. Now, people often assume that America's history of racism, racial divisions, makes it unlikely that conditions of perceived interdependence could be generated and lead to the development of a national multiracial coalition. However, there are cases from contemporary America that cast doubt on such pessimism, and I talk about some of these cases in America, indeed, in my book. Indeed, multiracial grassroots community organizations whose institutions, actions, and belief systems exemplify the very conditions of perceived interdependence do in fact exist today. Now, some have coalesced around the campaign for living wage ordinances in a number of cities, involving multiracial coalitions of local labor leaders, community-based organizations, religious leaders, and student groups. The living wage movement is an example of what can happen when local leaders forge coalitions to rally behind an issue that concerns all races, in this case, economic justice. Now, whether living wage campaigns will expand to embrace other issues of economic and social justice remains to be seen. If they do, they might take note of the experiences of a longer-standing and very effective multiracial political organization at the local level, namely the National Community Organization Networks of the Industrial Areas Foundation, IAF, located in 60 communities from California to Massachusetts. And I hope that the local representative of the IAF, Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, GBIO, will show up here tonight. He's supposed to be here at 8:30 because I'd love to get his comments on what I'm saying. IAF, Industrial Areas Foundation, very effective network of grassroots community, multiracial community organizations around the country. And some of the IAF's most successful organizations are in Texas. And included among these is a San Antonio-based Communities Organized for Public Service, COPS, generally regarded as one of the strongest community organizations in the nation. COPS is the largest and longest standing of the IAF local affiliates and has been responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure improvements in poor inner-city neighborhoods of San Antonio through the upgrading or repair of streets, sidewalks, public lighting, and sewer drainage, and the construction of parks and libraries. In addition, COPS has been responsible for the construction or rehabilitation of thousands of housing units. Indeed, in Texas, the IAF has created a model statewide network that has effectively influenced political decisions and municipal governments, the state legislature, and the governor's mansion. The head of the Southwest IAS, Ernesto Cortez, couldn't make it tonight. He called me this morning, said he couldn't come, something came up. A very effective, charismatic, visionary, grassroots community leader, head of the Southwest Texas IAF, and when Ernie gets on the phone and calls Governor Bush, you better believe that Governor Bush returns the call, because he's got those folks organized down there, and they've demonstrated their political power. Now, COPS has generated and sustained interracial cooperation in three related ways. First, it has relied on its members' shared commitment to broad religious principles to generate trust and a sense of common identity, because a lot of the leaders come from faith-based organizations. And second, the issues they focus on originate from local consensus, and they're framed in a race-neutral way so that they are not divisive. And third, Hispanic, African American, and white leaders are united in local IAF organizations but retain significant autonomy by also serving in other organizations or enterprises that address race and neighborhood-specific issues that are not formally part of the Texas IAF agenda. Now, the IAF does take up many, quote, issues of race, unquote, like poor schools, health care shortages, lack of economic opportunity, neighborhood neglect in the sense of sanitation departments not going into these neighborhoods with the same degree of enthusiasm and thoroughness that they do in other neighborhoods. But it frames these issues in non-racial terms, you see. It emphasizing the interests of the entire community in addressing them. It practices a local version of universalistic public policy, developing programs potentially open to all, but with special benefit to low-income minority communities. Now, the IAF in Texas has been successful in building an effective multi-racial coalition by presenting issues in non-racial terms. But the question I put to you is this: would such a strategy be viable in the long run for a national multi-racial coalition? Now, for the most part, if the coalition is trying to build support for a mass-based economic agenda, you know, talking about basic bread and butter issues like the New Deal coalition, a race-neutral strategy does make sense. Why? Because the goal is to attract wide segments of the population with messages that resonate across racial groups. And here I'm quoting from Jennifer Hochschild and Rael Rogers' interesting paper, quote, "Both survey and case study evidence suggests that the more a multiracial coalition focuses on issues of racial and ethnic equality per se, the less stable it will be, and the more likely it will be to fragment into competitive factions. Conversely, the same evidence shows that the more a multiracial coalition focuses on issues that are not ostensibly about race, and that have the potential to involve a wide range of people of all identities, the greater its chance of persistence and success, unquote. There is some debate, however, over whether the race-neutral strategy is the best way to engage minority communities in political activities. Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres, for example, contend that the most effective way to achieve this, that is getting minorities involved in the coalition, is to organize them first around issues that are race-specific. Yet whether or not racial issues are the point of entry for people of color, a national multiracial coalition must nonetheless emphasize concerns that unite its diverse constituency. And this does not mean that such a coalition must steer clear of all issues of race. The challenge is framing them in such a way that does not divide the membership. And in the book, I take up the issue of affirmative action, which is an issue that a multiracial coalition really cannot afford to ignore if it's going to generate some excitement among blacks. It's easy to deal with these issues in a non-racial way at the local level, but at the national level, it's going to be tough to ignore an issue like affirmative action. But there are ways in which you can talk about affirmative action that's not divisive. I don't have time to go into that now, but I do talk about in the book how we can shift the attention away from numerical guidelines and quotas and that would allow people to highlight the term preferential treatment and talk instead about opportunity, leveling the playing field, which most Americans support. And there's considerable research to suggest that if you emphasize opportunity, leveling the playing field, have flexible criteria of evaluation instead of just relying solely on standardized tests so you can identify potential to succeed, people support that. And that's very positive affirmative action. So you want to frame these issues in a way that they're not divisive. And considering the success of the IAF and other multiracial coalitions at the local level, is it possible to build such a coalition at the national level? I think it is, especially now, and I'd like to end on this note. A sustained upward trend in the American economy has begun to improve conditions for many people in the late 1990s. Ordinary Americans are still economically anxious and they continue to be worried about their future. But public opinion polls reveal that they are more satisfied today than they were in 1994 when the Republicans took over Congress, and in 1995 when conservative political leaders perceived that their pronouncements about the adverse effects of affirmative action, welfare, and immigration would resonate with the general population. The intensity and frequency of these messages have notably declined. And I think we can thank the strong economy as one of the reasons for that. Now is the time for proponents of multiracial coalitions to build on this shift in the public's mood. Hell, you even have Bush talking about compassionate conservatism. That's in sharp contrast to the rhetoric Newt Gingrich was using in 1994. Now is a time for proponents of multiracial coalitions to build on this shift in the public's mood, and in so doing, it will become increasingly clear that discussions emphasizing common solutions to commonly shared problems promote a sense of unity, regardless of the different degrees of severity and the problems afflicting different groups. Such messages bring races together, not apart, and they are especially important during periods of racial tension. And the lessening of the social tensions that have come with recent improvements in the economy allows us room to discuss our country's future, and I feel that the needs of ordinary working Americans can best be met by multiracial, broad-based coalitions. And although elites invariably have a say in the leadership of the nation, the voice of the people can be lessened by fragmenting the masses into competing, divisive, race-based groups. So in my book, I call upon the American people, and especially the leaders of the poor, the working classes, the displaced and the marginalized, the downsized and the de-skilled, to discuss in vocabularies that reject the unuseful particularisms of race, the true task before us. Thank you.
That was excellent.
It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be able to offer a few reflections on Bill Wilson's wonderful new book, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide. Bill and I have been friends and colleagues and co-workers for a very long time, before we were at Harvard, in fact, at the University of Chicago. So I don't think this will be a searing critique, but I do have a few different angles of vision to offer on a number of the provocative issues of strategy and tactics that Bill has raised. Bill is, of course, a leading student of American social trends and has been for many years because he thinks acutely about how racial inequalities figure along with disparities of class in the larger patterns of inequality and conflict in American society. And he always thinks hopefully as well as realistically about how racial divisions can be superseded in a genuinely democratic politics. Over the years, there have been some subtle changes of emphasis in his work, I would say. He's gone from publishing a book that was perhaps extravagantly titled The Declining Significance of Race to a discussion in this new book about the bridge over the racial divide, about the various ways in which racial stereotyping has persisted and changed in late 20th century American society. He's underlining now how important it is for us to think carefully about how easy it is to fall into racial stereotypes or racially applied stereotypes, even when they don't appear to be overtly about black and white or brown and white. He's also made a shift from talking about race-neutral policy. He's used that term again tonight, but he more often now talks about transracial coalitions, about finding common ground, and about reaffirming our commitment to pulling people into full participation through what he calls in this book policies of affirmative opportunity, rather than the more regulatory and heavy-handed approaches to affirmative action that have occasionally appeared to exacerbate even people of goodwill in America over the last 25 years. He offers, I would say, a more tough-minded vision in this book, but still a very beguiling vision. And as you've seen, some important clues about the new patterns of politics and civic energy we may need to move toward transracial politics that can address and help to correct for some of the growing class inequities in American society. In talking about that political vision, and in that sense of political strategy, that's where I'd like to direct most of my remarks tonight. He's very eloquent on the movements that I know we both admire a lot, the movements of the Industrial Areas Foundation, that represent a very specific strategy for pulling people together, mostly from faith-based organizations, but here in Boston, including many unions as well, into community coalitions that spend a lot of time knitting together one-on-one relationships among people within neighborhoods and congregations, across neighborhoods and congregations, spend a lot of time looking for ways to define concerns in the most broadly shared ways, and yet at the same time still define them as issues of power so that people recognize that there's something at stake and that they can make a difference by pulling together and acting vigorously. I find that part of his analysis of what the new politics of building cross-racial coalitions to address inequities might look like very convincing. I'm a little bit less convinced, though, at some of the suggestions he offers for how these new coalitions could be pulled together at the national level. And let me stress that I think all successful social movements in America operate both nationally and locally at the same time and find a way to link efforts at those two levels, probably some other levels too, into sustained effort over time so that the local feels energized by being part of something larger, and the something larger is not somehow detached from the settings in which people work and live their daily lives and raise their families. I see some danger that Bill's preliminary ideas about a transracial politics at the national level could prove a bit thin. He talks very eloquently in the chapter of the book that he didn't discuss much today about reframing the way we talk about affirmative action programs. I think he's right in stressing that many Americans are prepared to accept the enlargement of opportunity, that you can persuade people to tell a pollster that they will support policies or even to vote in a referendum for policies if you word them one way rather than another. And I'll say a little bit more about framing issues in a minute. But I don't think that a politics of rewording things is probably going to be enough, and I know Bill doesn't either. His other suggestion is that we pull together an alliance of various kinds of organizations, and he suggests perhaps a coalition of executives of a variety of kinds of groups. Here again, I think it probably is going to depend a lot on what kind of groups those are. The counter trends we face at the national level in our politics, the counter trends working against alliances that will pull together people from the middle class to the poor, across racial and ethnic divisions, to generate the power and the strength to regulate business in fair ways, to institute new social programs that can provide protections and buffers for workers and families in an era of global economic transformation. And frankly, to provide a politics that will say that it's not only where you went to college or whether you went to college that should count in what kind of reward you get in life, but recognize that we all have a place in a society, that we all have a stake in a society that makes life livable, comfortable for people who haven't been to college as well as those who have, for the middle class and the working class and the least privileged amongst us, as well as for those with postgraduate degrees and professional managerial occupations and large stock market accounts. That kind of politics is what we need. And I think we face a lot of powerful trends in late 20th century America, about to be early new millennium America, that work against that. I have a forthcoming book. I can't resist mentioning a couple themes from it. The Missing Middle, Working Families in American Social Policy. And in that book, I argue that there was a long history of a certain kind of successful social policy making and democratic politics, small d, in America, that stressed supports and benefits going to people in return for service to the community, cross-class and cross-racial programs and coalitions, partnerships between associations and government, and usually successful coalitions and programs also had some kind of access to rising and sustainable government revenues. Now, in all of these areas, we're seeing powerful countertrends in late 20th century America. Bill has already talked about some of the obstacles to cross-class and cross-racial politics. I would simply stress that the wars we've had over welfare programs over much of the late 20th century have been very divisive along lines of race, but also gender, and have pitted those who felt they were working for a living against those they perceived, often incorrectly, but nevertheless perceived as getting something for nothing from government. We've seen an erosion of partnerships between associations and government because our civic life has been transformed in directions that are much more top-down. We have advocacy groups, pollsters, and media experts, rather than membership associations and powerful unions, shaping a lot of our community life and our national civic life. And of course, we've had sustained attacks by conservatives on taxes and the putting forth of an argument that broad coalitions should form in America around the proposition that we deserve to keep all we earn in the private market and that we should be investing it in private accounts rather than contributing to shared social programs like Social Security and Medicare. To counter all of that, I think we need to recapture all aspects of the most successful social politics in American history, and now we have to do it, and we have the opportunity to do it, in a late 20th century society that holds the promise of racial inclusion and equality much more than the society in America before the 1960s, before the Civil Rights Revolution. I find Wilson's work challenges me to think much more about the place of racial divisions and cross-racial coalitions in the new kind of politics that I believe is possible. A politics focused on the shared needs of working families and the new dilemmas of how to put together working life and family life in an era where most families, whether they're headed by one or two breadwinners, have parents who are trying to combine the raising of children, contributions to the community, with participation in ever more demanding workplaces. I think those are the substantive themes that can bring a broad coalition together around concerns that are broadly shared across class lines by families, black and white, brown and white, of all ethnic backgrounds. But Wilson does challenge me to think about how we're going to handle the potentials for racial division and how we're going to redefine policies for including and drawing out leadership from every racial group in the process of constructing such a new politics. In turn, and I'll end with this, I like to challenge him to think even more deeply about the kinds of social organization and civic participation that we might need to create a transracial politics. I think it's going to have to be a politics centered on membership associations knit together, not just the leaders of advocacy groups. It's going to have to be a politics that can link community-based participatory movements with more genuinely participatory movements at the national level. And I think it's going to have to be a politics that probably has something to do with a political party, since I can't envisage creating the leverage through government to address the inequities that Bill is discussing without reinvigorating the Democratic Party. I think he's describing what a Democratic Party ought to be like, and I'm prepared to name it. I don't think this is an either-or. I think we need perhaps a movement knitting together membership groups across communities, including churches, unions, school-based groups, university-based groups, community groups of parents and children, perhaps a movement of families and communities for a better America. But at the same time, we need a real Democratic Party, something that people can vote for, and a set of politicians who are willing to work in a sustained way, to use government, to leverage government, to speak to some of the values and the needs of that broad civic coalition. And I think we're going to need a language that's a little bit more robust and a little bit more imbued with a shared sense of moral vision than the language of class or the language of correcting the inequities of international trade. I accept that analysis as an analysis, but I don't think that's the language people will resonate with. And my work suggests that people resonate with a language of contribution to the community, and the community in return giving people support to both reward them for the contributions they give and prepare them to be active contributors. I think that moral language of contributing to the community, getting in return to prepare you to contribute or to reward you for contributing, is the kind of language that can encompass the policy vision in the Bridge Over the Racial Divide, which is a transracial politics speaking to the needs and values of the majority in an era of growing economic pressure and inequality, and a new way of thinking about the goals of affirmative action. It's not just opportunity we're trying to spread around. We're trying to spread around invitations to and openings for everyone to become a maximally effective contributor to the local and the national communities that we all share in common.
Before we open this up to questions, I'm going to give Bill a chance to respond, but while Bill is responding, if you would like to ask questions, you should line up at one of the two mics.
I just want to say that I find myself in agreement with everything that Theda has said. And there are certain points that resonated with me particularly. And one is to think more deeply about the kinds of social organization and civic participation that would provide the mechanisms to generate and sustain the coalition. That's a real challenge. That's something that I did not do in the book because I was more concerned about making the case for why a coalition is necessary, rather than talking about the mechanisms that would help to generate and sustain the coalition. I also very, very strongly agree with developing a language that resonates with people, a language that focuses on contributing to the community, the kind of language that people can relate to. And I think that in developing this language, Theda, we're going to have to do a much better job than we have done in developing sound bites that capture these points. One thing that the conservatives have done very well is to develop effective sound bites that resonate. You know, it's true that the conservative ideology lends itself to sound bites. You know, let's face it, If you're going to blame the problem on individuals, you can easily put that in a soundbite. I was talking to a group last night, and I was sharing my experiences that I had on talk radio. And there's some caller saying, Professor Wilson, the reason that these folks are in the position they're in is because of their values, the lack of work ethic, and so on. Now, that's the conservative position that Charles Murray and others take, and it does sort of resonate. You know, the dominant American belief system is that people are poor or in the position they're in because of personal deficiencies. That lends itself to sound bites. So here I am then trying to explain the more complex problems. So I start talking about the decreased relative demand for low-skilled labor due to the computer revolution, which displaces skilled workers and which rewards skilled workers and displaces low-skilled workers, and the growing internationalization of economic activity, which, and then I'm interrupted by the talk show host who says, I'm sorry, Professor Wilson, we have to take a station break. So we really do have to develop these sound bites that put us in a better position to offset some of the conservative messages.
That reminds me of David Ellwood, after his book, when he was on the Oprah Winfrey Show, was told he might have 30 seconds and he should get his messages into bumper stickers. Your bumper sticker would have such small print it would cause rear-end collisions, I think, Bill. I think you're right there. Okay, well, I'd like to now open it to questions. If you can tell us who you are and your affiliation and ask a question. We'll start here.
Okay. Hi, my name is Michelle, and I'm here first year at the Kennedy School. And I appreciated both of your comments, and I think they were very valid points, but I was wondering how you could address the current state of political apathy, the low voter turnout, because it seems like that's a very huge obstacle to overcome if you really get people motivated. What's going to make them, take political action, especially for the younger generation who votes in much lower turnout than the general population?
I think that one of the reasons we see such political apathy among the poor and some of the disadvantaged groups, they become alienated from the political system because they don't think that the political system is really relevant, really addressing their concerns and needs. But it's interesting. If you look at some of these areas where the IAF organizations are quite effective, for example, in Texas, take the city of San Antonio. I spent a lot of time down there visiting with cops and some of the other people involved in community coalitions in Texas. And I've been struck by how they've been able to sort of mobilize the masses, the poor, the black, the Latino residents, and they're very involved politically. They're very, very active. And one reason is that this organization has demonstrated that it can deliver. And one of the consequences, I think, of an effective multiracial coalition, that it would energize folks. It would get them involved. It would overcome the apathy. That's one of the challenges initially, to get apathetic groups involved, you see. But once this organization is in place and once it demonstrates that it's delivering and therefore it's addressing the concerns of ordinary people, I think it's going to affect political activity and certainly voter turnout.
Vito, do you want to respond to that?
Well, the questioner rightly underlined that many young people, and I think this is true of privileged as well as less privileged young people, are not voting, and in my experience, often expressing cynicism about politics. I think we have to see this as the end point of several decades of moving in the direction of a very top-down manipulative style of politics in which there are very few invitations for people to do much of anything except give money or give their opinions one-on-one. I do see some hopeful signs, though. I think a lot of people are trying to get involved more in community life and to get involved in various sorts of civic associations. And so in some ways, these transpartisan movements might be a bridge. People will vote when they begin to think that there is something at stake in elections. And we know that they do, even in the short run, because, for example, in the 1992 election, where it seemed there was more going on and more at stake, there was a higher turnout. We also know that the system is very slack and people are capable of pouring to the polls if something exciting seems to be happening, even the Minnesota example. I think that low voting is a symptom, and you probably can't just exhort people to vote. I think you have to offer them organized bridges and invitations and conflict that indicates something is at stake if you're gonna get them to engage.
Yes.
My name is Adam Taylor. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. Professor Wilson, I had the chance to hear you lay out a similar vision about 2 years ago about building a multiracial coalition at Emory University. And I was inspired then, just as I'm inspired now, and I think that what you're talking about is very reminiscent of what Dr. King was talking about very later in his life before his tragic death, when he was talking about confronting economic inequality and was trying to lead a poor people's march. And in my own thinking about this, I have come across three main challenges or obstacles, one of which the last question addressed, which has made it very difficult for me to figure out how we can operationalize this or make it happen. One is, from my own experience, when I talk about coalition building, particularly between groups of color, I have a hard time convincing a large segment of Hispanic and African Americans, particularly younger people, who feel so disaffected and betrayed by politics that it makes it very difficult to convince them to become a part of politics, let alone build coalitions within politics. A second one, which was mentioned earlier, is that the coalition you're talking about is... Oh, okay, sure. I think the mic is... Oh, my fault.
Yeah, back away a little bit.
All right.
Okay.
The coalition that you're talking about is composed of a group of people who are disproportionately disenfranchised and marginalized in our political system anyway, so which makes it very difficult for them to have a lot of clout. And with the power of campaign finance money in campaigns, I think it's not just about votes anymore, it's more so, or at least equally so, about money. And the third challenge that I faced is just the inability of our political system to talk about class-based issues. Total inability. It's like we come under this paralysis anytime we talk about class and the growing economic inequality that defines our nation. And so I was wondering if you could just help me kind of think about and deal with these three challenges and maybe how you've thought about them.
Well, let me say, first of all, to take the last point, the inability to talk about class-based issues. You notice I didn't use the term class once tonight, nor will you find the term class anywhere in my book. Because you know, class conflict, you know, you sort of put up a red flag there. So what I talk about ordinary families. People can relate to that. I'm not talking about the rich versus the poor. I'm talking about ordinary families. And so I think that we have to use a language, and Theda also is quite concerned about this, using a language that sort of resonates with people and doesn't really sort of put people off. So it's very important to sort of talk about this not so much in terms of class conflict, but in terms of addressing the concerns and the needs of ordinary families. You know, that's one thing. Secondly, he said, well, the coalition will consist mainly of these groups that have been disfranchised, you know, the marginalized. Again, it's sort of focusing only on the poor. But my coalition I envision a coalition that would capture, you know, 80% of the American population. I'm talking about the lower classes, the working classes, and the middle classes. I'm talking, for example, about those groups that have experienced stagnating or declining real income and wages, since 1973. 80% of the American population has been struggling. Now, in the last couple of years, as I said before, the real wage growth, the declining real wage growth has slowed somewhat. In fact, it has, the lower classes have experienced, I think, rather significant increase in wages during those 2 years. And so we could be seeing a new economic transformation taking place that would create a situation where a rising tide does indeed lift all boats, and we'd have a situation, a period which resembles a period from 1947 to 1973, when there was no significant differences in wage growth among different segments of the population. But that's the most optimistic scenario. The pessimistic one is that the inequality will continue to rise, and 80% of the American population has been affected. The top 20%, and especially the top 5%, have continued to enjoy increases in income during this period from 1973 to the present. And so what you have to talk about is ordinary families, most Americans, and what we can do to help them ease the burdens, and talk about the fact that some groups may experience greater economic problems than others, but in a sense we're kind of in a similar boat. I think that's how you have to talk about these things. And I think the coalition will not be powerful if it does not include a significant segment of the middle class. Now, how do you operationalize, as you put it, this? How do you get people who are kind of skeptical or pessimistic about working together, or don't even really believe that it's possible for blacks and Latinos and whites and Asians and Native Americans to work effectively together in a coalition? Well, here is, we have to address Theta's issue about how we're going to bring this about, what kind of mechanisms we use, and so on. But I must say this, that leadership is so very, very important. And in those areas of the country where you have visionary leaders like Ernesto Cortez, who understand what it takes to bring people together, who understand the importance of generating a sense of interdependence, who have the sort of charismatic appeal to really get people to listen, it's easy. But there are not that many leaders available out there, But I think that once this thing gets going, once we start discussing it, they will begin to emerge. And this is something that we have to think through. We have to think through, how we can overcome this opposition. What I would begin by, first of all, inviting leaders of various groups that represent what I take to be the core groups of the constituency. Women's rights leaders, civil rights leaders, labor union leaders, community activists. Bring them to Boston and sit down and begin talking about ways in which they can, overcome the opposition, and ways in which they can go back and meet with their constituencies and get things going. And you may start out with a small number, but eventually it may build over time.
Last question.
Good evening, and I want to thank both of you for sharing your viewpoints with us this evening. Professor Wilson, you mentioned that we have to leverage the playing field, and you also talked about bridge over racial division. Sometimes I think it's a concrete bridge, actually, but I believe it is real, it's alive, and I think it's well. I also truly believe that we live in in search of an embryo stage where a beginning. We're always in search of trying to find out a formula for a perfect peace. I believe that we continue to live in a world of have and have-nots. If you could personally change anything concerning the issues affecting diversity, the death I say, of affirmative action and the Census 2000 issue, where? Where do you think we're headed in the year 2000? And I'd like to have both of your viewpoints on that, please.
You want to begin, Theta?
I want to ask her to clarify, what do you mean, where are we headed in the year 2000?
I know you mentioned that we don't need advocacy. We need churches, communities to get involved, and Professor Wilson mentioned coalitions. So we're headed into the next millennium, and where are we on racial division? How is that affecting diversity, affirmative action, and Census 2000 issue?
Well, I just think there are two dimensions, and they don't entirely overlap. I mean, we're experiencing a lot of tension about affirmative action, and we're experiencing it partly because many people in America are realizing you have to go to college to get a decent job with opportunity for your family. And so that focuses all our attention on a set of institutions that have been run pretty mechanically around tests that sort people out and highlight all the tensions about who exactly gets through which doors, with those doors being perceived as opening or closing their future. I take Bill's book to be suggesting that we ought to be placing the emphasis more on multiplex measures of who has the potential to be a leader in various domains of our society. I would take a step further and say we need to focus all our attention, the attention of the community and many of the good and organized people across the land, on how can we make life decent, with a minimum of social protection and a maximum of opportunity for families and children, regardless of whether the parents have been to elite colleges. So, and I think there's a lot of potential for that kind of politics and that kind of civic life, because it isn't really a black-white thing. It's, Bill's quite right, it's really the bottom 70% or so of the society that is experiencing a whole series of new stresses. And I think that's true regardless of whether economic growth increases or doesn't, because the kind of economic growth and wage increases we're getting come at the price of two parents working harder for the kind of decent life that one parent used to be able to provide. Yeah. And many families don't even have the two parents. And that's not an issue just for blacks or whites. That's for both.
You know, when you think about where we're headed as the new millennium dawns, it's a relative thing. And if you had asked me this question in 1995, when all those demagogic messages were out there and our politicians were openly demonizing the most vulnerable groups, putting all of our problems on the shoulders of the welfare queens and the minorities and who benefit from affirmative action and the immigrants, my response would be quite different from the one I'm about to give. Despite the economic problems that people experience as reflected in trying to make ends meet by holding down two jobs, you have 6.5 million people holding down two or more jobs. That's a 65% increase since 1980. We work more than the Europeans, we take less vacation pay, we work longer hours, we even work more than the Japanese, and a lot of that is we're just trying to make ends meet because of the slow growth in wages over time and declining real income. We're trying to maintain our standard of living. Despite all that and all the stresses this creates for families as they're trying to deal with their kids because they're working so many hours, and it does present a problem of getting people involved politically because they're working so long. The situation is still a lot better today than it was in the first half of the 1990s, and I thought that was a scary period because I thought we were on the verge of a demagogic mobilization of racism. And I think that the social tensions have lessened since 1960. There are a lot of things, some are symbolic, like the bombing, the Oklahoma bombing made people sit back and think twice, and I think President Clinton's best hours were when he gave that speech about about bigotry and hatred in America. And I think that people's views about situations have somewhat changed because they feel a lot better about things today than they did in the first half of the 1990s, even though they're still struggling. And I really believe that those are some of the reasons why the frequency and intensity of these demagogic messages have decreased. And so I think that liberals should seize the opportunity. I think that the American people are now looking for new kinds of leadership. I think that they're more open to progressive ideas today than they were a few years ago. And if progressives do not seize the opportunity, then they're going to look back on this as a period, as a failed period.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for not introducing myself. I'm Margaret Stevens. I'm attending the Executive Development Training class here with Harvard School of Government. Thank you very much, and good luck on your book. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Estelle Rafa, I'm a retired social worker. Your description of the success of the coalition in Texas makes me wonder whether it wouldn't be better to concentrate on coalition building at the state level and the local level, and to build these numerous building blocks across the country, eventually to make a pyramid with a national organization at the top. But I think at the local level, people can recognize each other more easily. They know their local problems, and I think it might be an easier path to take than to try to start at the national level.
Right, you know, that's a very good question, and I'm really glad you brought it up because it gives me the opportunity to briefly clarify my point. I strongly agree with you that we've got to begin at the local level and build up. That's why I talked about these networks. I mentioned some of these core groups, community organizations, civil rights organizations, labor unions, women's rights groups, religious organizations. What I have in mind is these organizations organizing folks at the local level, building up from that to the regional level with the ultimate goal in mind of developing a national coalition, not just a local coalition. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to clarify that. Thank you.
I want to thank Bill and Theda for what's been one of the most visionary forums we've had at the Kennedy School in some time, and an important forum for our country. Thank you very much.